We're going to talk a little bit about commerce and sort of which is the part of the digital transformation pillar. It's a bit noisy in here. Thank you all. It's quite hard to talk when everyone else is talking as well. So we're going to talk about commerce and payments, which is I would say the oil or the rails in which a lot of commerce rolls through. With the success of mobile money platforms such as M-Pesa and Paga, what is the next frontier for instant and inclusive payment systems in Africa, and how are you positioning your operations to capitalize on it? So I'll ask maybe Tayo, you go first, and then Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Mayowa, and thank you everyone for being here. I think first of all, just maybe to set the stage, what Paga does, we are a mobile payments company. I like to say we're building the PayPal for Africa. And what we're really focused on is how do we solve financial stagnation that comes from the fact that we're very cash-driven societies without access to credit or credit lines. And that makes it difficult for individuals to achieve their financial goals in life, as well as for merchants to achieve commerce. So to your question, we are focused on Nigeria. And we currently have about 23 million users on our platform and scaling at a really fast pace in terms of transactions going through. What we've seen is that there is a real move to digitization. And that is buoyed by the fact that the Central Bank of Nigeria has also said, come, forgive my French, come hell or high water, we're going to go cashless in Nigeria. And so that's a really good wave, and it's also driving financial inclusion in Nigeria. So I think the next phase, what we've seen in phase one, in my mind, is people using systems like Paga to send money to other people, using it to pay their bills and pay their basic utilities. I think phase two is really going into commerce. And it's really about how merchants now are being digitized and using alternative methods to collect payments and to drive their growth in their business and to reduce corruption even within their own businesses, right, and theft. So I think we're going to really see that pick up, and at the same time, we're also going to see picking up access to different types of financial services. And I think that's what we're expecting as we go into this sort of next phase of acceleration. But it's been really great to see the adoption. I mean, our friends at M-Pesa kicked this all off in East Africa. And Nigeria, I think is really following through on this. Last month, as an example, was the first time on our platform that we processed $1 billion in a month, right? And I was talking to the M-Pesa guys, they're about 10 times ahead of us in where they are. But but it's really great to see how that is accelerating across Nigeria.
Stephen, how about you? What's been the experience over on the other side of the continent?
So they're clearly growing very fast. We're still the largest payment services provider in Africa, but clearly not for very long. M-Pesa, we've seen quite a transition around the growth of M-Pesa. So initially it was just to, peer-to-peer transaction, exchange of e-value. That has since grown to, payment of bills, airtime, things like that. We've seen, we've moved to the level of borrowing. So, the M-Pesa platform is used for borrowing. People are using it for saving. So the whole financial inclusion space. Where I think this is going to go, now, locally speaking, of course, all our governments are digitizing at a very fast rate. What that means is we need a lot of our people to get the ideal devices that would allow them to engage at a digital level with the government. When the current administration came in, we had about 300 government services that were available digitally. Within 90 days, a deadline that had been given by the president, we got to about 5,000 plus. And so I think just creating a lot more opportunities for people to transact with the government digitally. But beyond that, I think the AFCFTA really will grow through the utility of digital mobile platforms. So cross-border collaboration has to be key. I mean, there are multiple payment systems across the continent. Being able to collaborate with them, both from a regulatory perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, so that we are not isolated islands within our countries or regions. I think that's going to be critical for the success of the AFCFTA. which therefore means that infrastructure, the infrastructural support and connectivity needs to grow. What we're also seeing in terms of innovation in M-Pesa is moving into the space of insurance, moving into the space of wealth management, wealth creation. So basically using this platform to do pretty much everything else you can do without a digital platform, but on the digital platform. So I think the essence of having policy support at a continental level, but also at a country level to make sure that we have the right regulatory support to allow for the growth, because without the sort of regulatory support across the borders, then it becomes difficult to scale up. So that's where I think we are going to go to. I mean, digital payments is at its nascent stage, I think. We still haven't seen what it can do to transform our continent.
Absolutely. One of the things that a stat that always makes me very, very, always surprises me when I read it is that despite all that's happening, Africa's digital payments, only 10% of digital payments, only 10% of payments in Africa are digital.
Yeah.
So there's still a long way for us to go.
Yeah.
Speaking of that sort of long tail, 90% that still needs to transition into digital payments, I'm going to switch to you, Ali, and talk a little bit about financial inclusion, right? And when we talk about financial inclusion, a lot of focus is on accessibility and not necessarily affordability. So what are some of the things that companies in your portfolio companies are doing to help ensure that people are not excluded from sort of this digital transformation that's happening in payments?
Yeah, well, so you mentioned briefly, I think a lot of the continent's use of cash is due to the mistrust of the banking systems. I think we have a long history of, you put your money in the bank and then you come back the next day and it's not there. Or if you're in a country with high inflation, it's worth a third of what it was before. So for us, in terms of the investments we're making, it is systems with like very low usage fees. We try to have those fees, if they exist at all, have them be very transparent, and so folks know what they're being charged per transaction. And then also accessibility, so the ability to convert your digital money back to cash as soon as possible, as soon as you want. The other thing, so I work at Caper Capital, early stage venture capital firm. We're investing pre-seed to Series A. And I think you right now we're seeing a lot of AI evolution happening in the States. Africa has been left behind a bit because they have all this data. Every time you use your M-Pesa or you transfer money using MTN, you're producing data. And so we see this as a huge opportunity for SMBs to capture more customer value. So you have this beautiful scarf on, the store, if you had bought that from a small merchant in Nairobi, for instance, one of our companies, Tappy, utilizes like your swipe with M-Pesa to be able then to send you push notifications and say, if you like this scarf, you should also get the matching dress. It would complement you. And that was something we hadn't previously seen in Africa. They were excluded from like utilizing these big data sets. So we want the small business to have the same availability to drive, value to their customers as the big corporations do here in the US.
Amazing, amazing. And I think someone says data is a new oil or something, that people talk about that all the time. But speaking about data, Ty, I'm going to come to you on this question about how do you keep all this data secure? How do you think about ensuring that you're not victim to someone locking you out of your system and demanding millions in Bitcoin
absolutely.
to get access to it? What are the sort of things that we need to start thinking about, given we're going into a new realm of commerce?
When it comes to data security and privacy, I like to say it's rings of security that you have to put in place and ensure that you also have the right risk and compliance policies and posture for businesses. So it starts from everything on the hardware layer, on the data centers, et cetera, all the way to educating customers about how they protect their login credentials. And I'll give you a real life example from just yesterday, actually. I was interacting with someone on Twitter or X, yesterday, and he, you know, in the typical Nigeria way, like, hey, can you, you know, do Sunday, or, you know, do something for us, you know, like give me something. So I said, hey, send me your Paga account, and I will do it. And he's like, oh, I don't have one. I'm like, register, and I'll send you something.
I like that customer
Right.
acquisition strategy.
I was like, you know, you want me to give you something? I'm not sending you a bank account. Register a Paga account. So he goes and he registers, and I was, you know, and then he later in the day sends me a message saying he got a message from our customer service saying that he had to send money to them to upgrade his KYC. And I was like, what? And I said, send me a screenshot of the username. Long story short, it's a fraudster, right? Who saw my interaction on X and immediately messaged him. And he was almost falling for this thing, right? Which is weird. Like, I'm going to give you money, but I'm telling you that you have to, you know. So I was like, oh my God, no, don't do it. Don't, because those, so what we're seeing happening is people phishing, right? And what you do there and what we've done, I remember actually when I started the business, early days of the business, Mitch at Interswitch, the CEO of Interswitch, who is a forerunner in the payment space in Africa, said to me, hey, this is the company you should use to fight this kind of fraud. So we actually have a company that we can use to take down any phishing website like that, right? Like, or any handle that we find. But they keep propping up. So I think where we are is that systems like ours have all done the hard work on our side of making sure there's two-factor authentication all the time, making sure that our systems are well secured and protected. Now what we need to do is educate the public not to give out their PIN number, not to give out their passwords, right? And to protect these things. And I think there's just a lot more work that has to be done. And we need government to also step in. We need the regulators to step in to do public awareness around this stuff. But that's, I think, the big work to do.
You know, I can't help but think that this also could be part of the, we know we talk about accessibility, affordability, and all of that, but these also kind of lead to lack of trust, right? Which also then hinders adoption.
Correct.
Right, so what are the kind of things that, you know, we are doing with the public? You talk about educating the public, but what are the kind of things you're doing with folks to get them to not fall for this and also not use that as a barrier not to adopt?
Yeah. So there are two main approaches that we've taken. One is just continuous messaging publicly, right? That don't ever give out your password. You know, so we do SMSs, we do emails, and then we post on our social channels. But I think more importantly is at the grassroots level through our agent network. So we have a network of agents across Nigeria, about 140,000 locations in every LGA. Through those agents to communicate, and as they are getting people to register accounts, teach them what not to do. Right, like, and how to handle and protect. So those are the main things that we focus on.
Great. I'm going to come to you again, Udi. And I'm just talking a little bit about how we can make payments, because now that we've talked about the trust issue with cybersecurity and cyber crimes, but given the various levels of I would call it sort of diversity of the economies and the different levels of tech adoption. How are you ensuring, or how your company is ensuring, that payment systems are flexible enough, especially as you think about scaling across markets? So in Nigeria, a lot of people would say they use EFT. In Kenya, it's mobile money. In other markets, it's card. How are your companies ensuring that your payment systems are flexible enough to deal with the sort of variety across the continent?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. So both so Tapi, Ajua, they have people on the ground where they operate. They're in Nairobi, they're in Lagos, they're even, they're in VI. If you talk to, the dynamic in VI is different than the one that is in Lagos. And so, if you go to Rwanda, you have to go to, you can't just say, this is our strategy for this country. Because as much as, us we like to think that Africa is one country, it's many countries, and even within those countries, there's different ecosystems. And so they're setting up ecosystem strategies in the places and doing their research before they launch there. You were talking about a little bit about the fraud. It reminded me, so my family is from Delta State in Nigeria, and all my friends would always be like, yeah, you Nigerians are scammers. Like, that's what they know about Nigeria. It's very sad. And I was like, no, we're just smart enough. And that, you fall for the scams. And one of our companies took the people, the 409 boys, and he knew that there was a computer location where folks did their scams out of. He had this idea, what if we took the people who were operating the scams, and in the States there's something known as white hat hackers. And so what if we hired them to help build our systems and help our customers navigate the issues that came up? And it turned out to be really great. They're actually spinning out that cybersecurity unit for the rest of Africa because they learned from the criminals. It's actually something that the criminal system does here in the FBI. Sometimes they'll hire folks to help them create the strong payment systems and navigate the crime that happens. And so for us, it's really about being on the ground and talking to your customer.
Wonderful, wonderful. Stephen, I'm going to come to you with this question. It's slightly unfair. Anytime I get asked regulatory questions, I have to speak very, very carefully in case the regulator is in the room, and I'm sure there are a few here. But as we're seeing this massive sort of digital revolution, especially in the payments space, what regulatory hurdles are you encountering, or companies in the space encountering? So I'll say companies in the space, not necessarily M-Pesa, are encountering that could potentially slow down or stall the transformation that we're seeing at the moment?
That's a very good question and very, very relevant. I'll share two examples. The first is the story of M-Pesa going to the Central Bank of Kenya, and at the time I used to work for the regulator of communications in Kenya, coming to the regulator of communications to say, look, we have this product. Thinking public funds, go to the regulator of financial services, and they say, we don't understand this, but you know what? Why don't you guys just go ahead and we will make regulations on the fly as we understand it. And we've only just recently, the central bank has only allowed us to increase the limits of how much can be transferred. That is really the message of how regulators ought to approach innovation, because if they don't, we wouldn't be talking about M-Pesa.
I was going to ask you that, do you think sort of fast forward 20 years, any regulator will now say, we're going to do this on the fly today?
So I think the difficulty has been in ensuring that the messaging with the regulators remains, do not over-regulate. The second illustration I will share is having met a certain gentleman from the Central Bank of Liberia at a conference who congratulated us for opening an M-Pesa branch in Liberia. And what ended up happening is we had never opened M-Pesa in Liberia. So apparently, they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. That was an extreme form of imitation because it was illegal. So
someone had stole your brand?
Someone had taken our brand, registered the IP, walked into the central bank and got a license for M-Pesa, and was called M-Pesa. And so, so that's the other challenge, that IP protection, the regulatory support to ensure that the IP gets protected is really, really crucial. And we have to do this across Africa, because this is really what we have left in terms of scaling our services. So beyond that, obviously, KYC has to be a really big thing, but you cannot be too strict with KYC as to chill innovation. So the regulators need to balance between the kind of KYC balancing, KYC requirements versus the innovation. So the only other things would be regulatory parity across the different countries to ensure that we can interconnect, we can interoperate, ensure our systems are talking to each other. I think with that, innovators, technology will do its thing without much help, actually.